everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. My name is Sarah Jepson, and I'm the Planning Director here at SCAG. So we want to thank you for joining our Financing the Future, Funding Resilient Infrastructure in Response to Climate Change workshop. This workshop is part of the broader outreach that we're doing on SCAG's Regional Climate Adaptation Planning Framework project, which we are pleased that we received a Caltrans grant, SB1 grant, to support this work. You'll also see, for those of you that are here, you'll also see in our lobby a pop-up that is for climate education that we hope you will check out. And it's the pop-out has been moving about the region as a tool to educate our residents on the impacts of climate change and how it affects them. So please check it out, and hopefully you'll see it elsewhere in the region. We're looking, as part of this broader plan, we're looking at how Southern California can work together to plan and prepare for the impacts of rising temperatures and sea levels, more frequent and damaging wildfires, mudslides, severe weather events, and other climate-related impacts. It seems like we have it all here, so we certainly need to be prepared. Addressing climate change and reducing our region's contributions to greenhouse gas emissions is a really important part of our regional transportation plan and sustainable communities strategy. And to simplify that, we now call that plan Connect SoCal, and the draft is out there, and we hope you will take a look at it. Within Connect SoCal, part of our core vision is to is maintaining and preserving our transportation network. And this cycle, we added even greater resources for preservation, recognizing that we need to do more to make our system resilient to the impending impacts of climate change. In addition, I'm trying to tease you into reading our plan here. Please check out the public health section of and technical report of Connect SoCal, because we have an analysis of climate change and impacts and how it will affect health in our communities. And finally, within the plan, we do recognize that there's far more work to be done, and the plan proposes that SCAG move forward with a regional resilience framework, and so that's work we're hoping to pursue in the upcoming years. So resilient infrastructure that supports conservation and the restoration of our natural systems, we all know must be a part of our future so that we can have a thriving economy. Today, our workshop will focus on financing opportunities for projects responding to climate change, include topics ranging from budgeting to funding sources, including tax increment financing and EIFDs, which have been kind of a bright spot in some of the work that we've been doing here at SCAG. The speakers for today are Robert Spencer from Urban Economics, Nguyen Tara Key from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Mark Northcross from NHA Advisors, as well as Larry Cosmont and Joseph Dieguez from Cosmont Companies. So thank you in advance for all of our speakers for being with us here today, and for all of you for participating in this important work that we are working on together. I also wanted to highlight the consultants that are supporting this effort, including Cambridge Systematics, ESA, and Here LA. So with that, thanks again for being with us today, and I will hand it off to Bob.
Okay. Thanks very much, Sarah, and good afternoon, everybody. We have a exciting show for you today, at least from a public finance perspective. I get pretty excited about this stuff. So my name is Bob Spencer. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the world of climate adaptation and resilient infrastructure and public finance. I'll be your primary speaker. I've got over 30 years of experience providing economic and financial consulting services to cities, counties, and special districts throughout California, from Raleigh to Eureka. So I've got to know this state pretty well. And I'm excited to share with you today how we can take our infrastructure planning and public administration tools and apply them to climate change. We will be taking a few polls today. And so I'll be giving you instructions in a minute on how to sign in, and look forward to your responses. We will also be circulating the slide deck for this presentation after the presentation to all participants. So don't worry about taking down detailed notes or anything like that that's might be on a slide that you'll be getting in your inbox afterwards. Then we have a few other housekeeping issues. We'll be taking questions at the end of each section in the presentation. So feel free, if you're in person here, you can ask the question in person. If you're on the web, there's a chat box that you should be able to provide a question.
If folks could mute their phone or computer, we're getting some feedback.
On the hall, if you need to take a break, and we have refreshments over here as well. So with regards to the agenda today, we've got 9 parts. Will be an introduction, then I'll get into a brief overview of climate hazards facing the SCAG region. These are imminent threats, and our communities really need to start looking at what actions they can take now. In the third section, we're going to provide an update from New and Tara Key on adaptation finance from the state's perspective. In the fourth section, I'll convey a toolkit for climate adaptation finance to begin building a new muscle. To begin building a new muscle as we try and work through integrate climate adaptation into our work. Then after that, we'll focus in the mainstreaming section, section 5, on how to get this work into your everyday world as a public asset manager at the local level. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some case studies in section 6, where we'll hear from Joseph Dieguez of the Cosmont Companies and Mark Northcross as well from NHA Advisors. And we'll review a summary broad summary of funding sources towards the end of the presentation in case we've missed anything, and wrap up with Q&A. So let me start with what this presentation is and what it isn't. Climate-related investments range all the way from mitigation on the one hand to adaptation on the other. And you know, a mitigation action might be a wind farm or renewable energy investment. In the middle, we've got actions that do both, like energy efficiency in buildings. Those both provide mitigation by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as well as adaptation, because they make the building more resilient to, say, extreme weather events. On the far right, we have some adaptation benefits that actually are not helpful from an emissions perspective, such as fossil fuel backup supplies, again, to help buildings survive extreme events. So we're going to be focusing on the adaptation side of the spectrum today, not the mitigation side. In addition, this webinar is really focused on things that cost money. There's a lot of adaptation work that is critical and should be done that is not necessarily all that expensive to do. This involves policy and program work around zoning and building codes. Certainly all the work being done in the finance industry around climate risk disclosures, the work that can be done at the state level around real property sales disclosures and municipal bond disclosures. That's all very important work, but we're going to be looking at the payable side of this, everything from natural infrastructure, green infrastructures such as wetlands restoration, through non-natural or gray infrastructure, seawalls and the hardening of buildings, and then we'll be touching on financial incentives as well. Those are an important component of any adaptation program. All right, now let's see who's online and try out our first poll here. You can activate the poll by either on your browser, go to pollev.com. The instructions are on the screen there, and sign into the SCAG Adapt 2824 account, or you can text SCAG Adapt 2824 to on your phone. You can text it and then to 22333. and that should get you to join as well. So. Oh. There we go. Okay, 31% city, 38% other. Well, I should have added more categories, clearly. We'll have to work on that for the next time around. And then I've got the next poll here is what's the population of your jurisdiction? So let me go and open that up. Okay, now that one's open. These population divisions, by the way, they roughly represent quartiles in the SCAG region. So about 25% of cities and counties are less than 25,000. Another quarter, 25 to 50, then 50 to 100, and the top quartile or 25% would be over 100,000. So it looks like we have some very large organizations represented here. Not surprising in that adaptation work is a particular challenge for smaller agencies. So let's get back to the presentation. Thank you very much for responding. And I'm going to go over climate hazards in the SCAG region here just to try and set the stage for what we're facing. This map shows inundation from 2 meters of sea level rise along the coast. Current state sea level guidance recommends using 6.6 feet of sea level rise in planning adaptation strategies for critical infrastructure. It's a very low probability event by 2080, but it's the kind of probability that you would not want to be wrong about. So it's not an unreasonable goal to have. So we were talking about sea level rise and its effect on the coast of Southern California. Uncertainty is a key planning concept that we have to work through in this world of climate adaptation finance. There's if you're a local public agency manager responsible for any assets, you're going to need to integrate uncertainty into your planning. It's just a fact of life when it comes to climate change, and it's something we're going to be talking about more during this presentation. Here's a map of flood risks within the SCAG region. These are flood zones mapped by FEMA. These are 1% storm inundation areas that are mapped by a tool called Urban Footprint. So these areas also are subject to risk from, of course, severe rainstorms and flood events. Now let's move to fire. This, of course, is an example, a map of the fire risk in the region. Moderate, high, and very high fire hazard areas is mapped by the state. You can see that much of the region is exposed to fire risk, and that's something that also is going to be a key hazard and something we're going to be talking more about today. Here's a map of the extent of recent fires from 2009 to 2019. The Station Fire was the largest fire in LA County, burned 150,000 acres, lasted for 50 days, and there were 2 firefighter deaths associated with it. It was 10 years ago, actually. This is the 10-year anniversary. The Thomas Fire in 2017 was 280,000 acres and 1,000 structures destroyed with $2 billion in damage. The Ventura ag industry alone suffered $170 million of damage from that fire. And then the Woolsey Fire, very fresh in everybody's minds, I'm sure, from 2018, burned 97,000 acres with 1,600 structures destroyed and 3 fatalities. In that fire, 295,000 people were evacuated, had a credible impact on the region. So when we take these risks and we look at the amount of development, existing development in the region that's affected, we can chart it by hazard here. You've got fire hazard as the top risk, affecting over 200,000 units, dwelling units. Then flood risk affects about 150,000. Sea level rise affects less, and depends upon, of course, which scenario you're using. There's a 3-foot scenario and a 6-foot scenario shown here. For jobs at risk, the picture changes a little bit. Now inland flood zones are the highest risk for jobs in the region, followed by fire and then sea level rise. But then let's look at this by county and see how it varies by county. SCAG is a very large and diverse region, and the same effects are not going to be true everywhere. So here we've got you can see in Ventura, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties have the greatest share of their residential development at risk. This chart is showing the percent of dwelling units by county that are at risk for a given hazard type. So you can see the role that fire hazard plays in Ventura, Riverside, and San Bernardino. And of course, sea level rise is a risk that shows up in the coastal counties, LA, Orange, and Ventura. For the region as a whole, it might not look like much when you see that only 6% or so of dwelling units at risk for these combined hazards. But keep in mind, these are directly affected properties only. These are directly affected properties only. These are not, this doesn't take into account the fact that if your highway's flooded, you can't get to work. If a firestorm is affecting your neighbors, it's likely to affect you too, even if you're not directly affected. And of course, if our wastewater treatment plants aren't working on the coast, that's going to bother everybody. So it may seem like a small share of the total region, but the overall impacts can be quite significant. Here is the same chart for jobs. In this case, Ventura has the greatest number of jobs at risk, and a lot of that is from inland flooding. For the region as a whole, about 4% of jobs, again, are directly at risk. And keep in mind that that doesn't relate to the indirect effects of climate change that are going to ripple in many ways throughout the entire region. Now let's move to heat. Here's an interesting map of historical changes in heat. And Ventura ranks as the fastest warming county in the lower 48 states. In fact, the SCAG region as a whole has been warming faster than the rest of California. Over the period of the last 123 years or so, the SCAG region has been warming about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The state's climate modeling website that I'll discuss later in the presentation estimates that the region could see another 5 to 10 degrees of warming in the next 50 to 80 years. So what happens? What's the effect of warming? Warming causes what are called heat health events. These are events when there's a noticeable increase in negative public health impacts due to heat waves. This is a chart of the number of heat health events, number of days that had a heat health event in 2020, projection for 2020 for the SCAG region. And you can see most of the region is in the range of 1 to 10 or 20 days. But when you go to 2050, I'm sorry, in this case, you can see the region is looking much hotter. Many more areas are subject to heat health events in the range of 20 to 40 days per year. This also brings up a really important question about equity, because the impacts of extreme heat are inequitably distributed, with low income and elderly populations being much more susceptible. Here's a chart of extreme heat days in Riverside. In this case, we picked 103 degrees, which is quite hot. There were only 5 or less than 10 days at that range in Riverside in the summer, this last summer of 2019. And you can see that this is projected to increase up to between 40 to 90 days per year over 103 degrees by the end of the century. So this is these are extremely severe impacts that we need to be prepared to adapt to. Also note the high variability from year to year. That high variability makes it even more difficult to adapt, because you get lulled into a sense of ease when there's not so hot a year, and then it spikes in the next year. So these are real problems that we're going to need to start building resilient infrastructure and adapting to. Okay, now I'd like to, after that summary, go to another poll question and see if I can do this with avoiding any technical difficulties. So if pull up the next poll and let's activate it. So I'm curious, what are the primary climate risks that your agency should be allocating resources to? There we go. There we go. Oh. And let me, okay, we got to go to the, why don't you? There we go. Yeah. And this is a question where you can answer more than one. So extreme heat seems to be battling it out for the lead there. Seems to be maintaining its lead overall. Looked like extended drought is coming in a close second at this point, something I didn't even discuss, which is why I threw it on the slide here to see if anybody picks up on it. But actually fairly, reasonably evenly distributed across the risks that we've been talking about today. And I'm curious what the other is. So maybe in the Q&A, if there's other risks that we should be focusing on that we're not talking about today, I'd love to hear about those. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. All right. So, some call climate change an existential threat. I know public finance, not philosophy, so I prefer this. Well, we have Nuantara here from the state. I should say it's not purely unfunded. The state is doing quite a bit and allocating a substantial amount of resources so that we can begin to address this. So maybe it's mostly unfunded at this point. And I'd also say that, I'd like to say that that's for now, because we are going to have to allocate more resources in this direction in order to enable our communities to adapt. And indeed, if you include funding for disaster recovery, such as from the devastating wildfires we've had, that further increases the resources that we're allocating to adaptation. We need to shift spending from disaster recovery, though, to resilience and risk mitigation. A 2015 study by the National Institute of Building Sciences estimated a benefit cost ratio of 6 to 1 for federal spending on climate disaster, federal spending on disaster mitigation programs, and a 4 to 1 benefit cost ratio for adoption of stricter building codes. So the question is the extent of public support that we can gather to increase funding and resources to make adaptation investments and generate a positive return. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Nuantara, and she is going to take us through the an update on the state's efforts.
Great, thank you very much, Bob, and thank you to SCAG for inviting me to join today. It's really exciting to get to be here for this workshop. I'm Nuantara Key. I'm in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and I'm our Deputy Director for Climate Resilience. I will say it's also really exciting to see the SB1 adaptation planning grant dollars going to such wonderful use here in the SCAG region. So really appreciative of all the work that everyone is doing here to really bring this important conversation out and to have this great dialogue. So thank you all. I'm going to give a pretty brief kind of overview on some of the state's approach to climate more generally, and then drill into some of our adaptation and resilience work and tee up, I think, some of the conversation or some of the points that will be covered in conversation here today. So happy to take questions after my brief presentation here. Bob already went over a number of kind of localized climate impacts. I mean, from the state perspective, you know, we definitely recognize that, you know, California is one of the most kind of climate risky states there is. We have pretty much all natural disasters and climate impacts here, you know, from extreme wind events that are fueling wildfires, wildfire, you know, temperature increases and changes, both extreme events that were covered, but also changes in average temperatures that can have pretty, you know, severe impacts to agricultural production and other public health impacts as well. To sea level rise, we even have glacier melt, and we even have some tornadoes in some spots of the state. So we really get it all. So with that in mind, we, from the state perspective, definitely recognize that we need to stay committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we stay committed to the ambitious goals that we have set. But we also need to be coupling our work on emissions reduction in parallel with ambitious action on reducing risk of climate change and adaptation and resilience. So under the administration, you know, we're really focused on how do we bring adaptation and mitigation together in a more integrated, holistic approach to our climate goals. We also are really focusing on how do we move from ambition to action and really recognizing the scale of implementation that needs to occur across the state, you know, throughout the region and locally within communities to really be able to build resilience and respond to the impacts of climate change. So we're very focused right now on how do we drive towards implementation. And one of the key pieces to driving implementation is having the right funding and financing available to do that. And we know that that is a significant challenge to local governments, to regions, and also on the state side, we also are trying to figure out how do we make sure we're driving investments towards the right priorities that are going to help build resilience throughout the state. So what's here on this slide are just a couple snapshots. I'm not going to go through each of these, but of just some of the projected climate impacts that came from the state's 4th California climate assessment. These are statewide numbers. You know, Bob presented more localized regional information around climate risk, but we, you know, definitely need to be preparing for climate impacts. So this is a quick overview. This is by no means a full comprehensive inventory of all the different climate related legislation out there, but some of the key bills, both executive orders and then also legislation that have been passed over the years. And I just really wanted to highlight kind of a couple takeaways from this slide. One is, again, we are lucky in California that we have leadership from the state on climate, both from the executive and the legislative branches. And we also have seen over these last few years, a growing number of bills specifically looking at adaptation and resilience. And one of them I just wanted to tee up here is, which I'm imagining pretty much everyone in the room is aware of, but SB 379 that was passed in 2015, which requires local governments to incorporate climate into general plans. So in our office, we do a lot of work to provide resources and guidance to local governments on how to do that, as well as resources and tools. The other bill that I wanted to highlight is SB 246, which created our adaptation program at OPR. So I'm going to cover that a little bit and then tee up a couple pieces on the kind of funding and financing side before wrapping it up. So SB 246, created the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program at OPR. Our main charge through that program is to really better align state and local efforts on adaptation and resilience, but again, really focusing on local implementation and making sure that as we on the state, through our programs and funding, as well as policies, are really thinking about alignment with local implementation. So there are a couple components to our program. One is an advisory council that helps guide our program and the work that we do. The other is the creation of an adaptation clearinghouse. I'll get to the clearinghouse in just a minute. But the council has really helped us over the last few years. The program was launched in 2017, I should say, but really thinking about how do we chart a vision for what it is we're working towards in resilience. When we launched the program, we recognized that the state's work on adaptation and resilience was probably about a decade behind where our work on climate mitigation was. And we really needed to come up with a framework for what we mean by resilience, climate resilience, and what we're working towards. So our council helped develop vision, guiding principles, and then also did some kind of foundational work to help us better understand how to define vulnerable communities. And I just wanted to mention that here because I think as we're having a conversation today around prioritizing infrastructure investments and other types of investments, we really need to recognize that not all communities face the same vulnerabilities, and that many communities and many people in communities have different levels of capacity as well as face different vulnerabilities due to underlying social and economic factors and conditions. So really recognizing that our adaptation strategies need to not only be reducing risk, but also driving towards and benefiting communities that are at increased risk to climate change. So the other component of our program is the creation of an adaptation clearinghouse. I'm just going to quickly cover this. Would love for everyone to take a look. Really, the intent of the clearinghouse is to provide a resource and support a community of practice to adaptation and resilience practitioners or people who are working in this space to find resources to help support planning and implementation. One of the key areas that we've been focusing on is pulling together resources specifically around how to fund and finance adaptation efforts. So we have a series of case studies, but then also a topic page specifically around funding and financing. And again, it's not a full inventory, but we do point to a number of state grant programs that are available that can help achieve and support climate resilience outcomes. So really quickly, specifically focusing on how are we thinking about incorporating physical climate risk into the investments that we as the state are making. There are a couple executive orders that were passed over the last few years. One, Executive Order B 3015, which came under Governor Brown, and then more recently, Executive Order N 1919, which was signed by Governor Newsom just recently. The intent of these executive orders, especially starting with Executive Order B 3015, was the first time when state agencies were required to incorporate climate into planning and investment decisions. And Executive Order N 1919 really drives that work forward and gives clear direction to both transportation as well as our Department of General Services to incorporate climate into planning and investment decisions. So, like many of our local government partners, though, we have questions on how do we do that? What does that actually look like? Because it's not as a simple kind of accounting exercise to do that. So one of the resources that we pulled together coming out of Executive Order B3015 that I wanted to highlight here is our guidance. This is guidance for state agencies, so it's not guidance for locals, but I think it actually could be a really helpful resource for people thinking about how you incorporate physical climate risk into investment decisions and planning decisions. And it guides users through a step-by-step process on how to consider future climate risk in investment decisions. One of the other things that we're working on now in response to Executive Order N1919, again, is kind of taking that work a step forward, is actually mapping our downscaled climate projection data from CalAdapt, which I think will be covered in a little bit more detail later on today, but mapping that to state assets and really looking at how are we thinking about operation and maintenance of our facilities in context of changing climate conditions. So while we've gotten that far, I will say kind of, I think from the state perspective, probably similar to our local government partners, kind of what it means in terms of the next steps of how do you actually start identifying the right thresholds to inform investment decisions is an area where we are still exploring and trying to kind of figure that out for our own investments and assets. But we would love to learn from our local government partners as you are doing this work, and we can also share resources. So I'm going to wrap up as we learn more on how to do that. But I'm going to wrap up here with kind of two quick closeouts. One is, again, really focusing on how we integrate adaptation and mitigation together and thinking about our investments as driving both of those objectives forward. The second is where we're starting right now is really focusing on our current investments and taking opportunity to incorporate climate risk into our current investments and really leveraging that, and then figuring out what additional funding or additional new finance and funding mechanisms could be used, but really wanting to fill some of that gap, but really not wanting to miss the opportunity to really incorporate climate into all of the work that we're doing every day. So with that, I am gonna wrap up here, and I'm not sure.
Well, we
there's
have time
Q&A.
for questions.
Yeah.
If there's any questions for New and Tara? And turn on your microphone, please, when you ask the question.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jeff Newman. I'm from Caltrans. Thank you for your presentation. I just had one quick question. On, I think it was your first or second slide where you're looking at 2050, is it? Yeah, 21, so 2100, 2055, the two on the lower left. So the average burn area and then the insurance costs in the next 35 years increasing by 18%? Mm-hmm. Is that all?
That is very, so that is.
I just wonder how you got the 18, how whoever did this got the 18%.
Yeah, so the 18% was looking at a subset of specific counties. So it was not a full statewide assessment. And I will say that that analysis was done before the Camp Fire. Right. And before we saw some of the kind of additional shifts we've seen.
And I'm sure that's true.
Coverage.
And I just wanted to bring that forward because I know it's an evolving picture.
It absolutely
but I didn't
is.
want this slide to represent your version of, not your, but
Yes, no, that's a great point. And I will say that number, I mean, we know in some communities, I mean, it's a very localized kind of experience in terms of insurance coverage right now. So yeah, that's a great point.
We also will be hearing from Mark Northcross later in the presentation about fire risk insurance because that's a really important topic for a lot of communities right now. All right, any other questions? Any online? Okay, so thank you, Nuantara. Yeah. All right. As with all investment planning tasks, adaptation finance is about how to allocate scarce resources. Learning how to do this as a local public manager will take building a new brain muscle. This is just new work that we're going to need to integrate into our into our daily lives here, our daily professional lives. Wherever you may be in your career, I would argue you need to start looking at this and getting familiar with these terms I'm about to explore, because they're going to make a difference. It could make a difference in your community's health and welfare going forward. The challenge we face together is to develop an accepted professional practice that is useful to local agency staff in guiding adaptation investments and capable of withstanding the scrutiny of elected officials and the public they represent. So this is an attempt to start building that practice. I am standing on the shoulders of giants. There have been a lot of great people doing this work that I hope to mention and credit through this presentation. So how should we classify our responses to climate adaptation? First, what we're trying to do is avoid failure. Trying to avoid our buildings burning, our homes getting flooded. We're trying to avoid that climate impact making a difference in our lives. One way to do that is a resilience investment. This is basically about preserving the relative status quo through recovery from a temporary climate impact. The next approach is a risk mitigation investment, also known as hazard mitigation in the language of FEMA and the State Office of Emergency Services. And then finally, we've got full adaptation, where you basically get out of the way of the impact and it no longer has a chance to affect you. Resilience investments typically are the front line of adaptation. They cost less and accrue fewer benefits than risk mitigation or full adaptation. As climate impacts increase, resilience is no longer financially feasible, failure becomes more likely, and mitigation is more required. Eventually, climate impacts become so severe that some type of full adaptation might be needed and would become the most financially feasible approach. These concepts are important because they frame options and trade-offs that are central to an investment analysis. They highlight the tensions between investment and disinvestment, short-term and long-term bias, uncertainty and risk, and the inherent trade-offs among values accruing at different times to different parties. These concepts may be new to many of you, but they will be useful as you consider the trade-offs inherent in any adaptation investment plan. Let's look at some examples. The lines can blur between resilience, risk mitigation, and full adaptation, but it remains a helpful spectrum to keep in mind. There's a trend towards increasing benefits and increasing costs as you move from resilience to full adaptation. Under full adaptation, I know management retreat is not necessarily a popular topic, but it has been embraced by communities along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast, or I should say is beginning to be embraced by communities. Like Norfolk on the Atlantic coast has already zoned areas to prevent any additional development. And the state of Louisiana has a statewide adaptation plan that includes managed retreat as a component. I don't know with regards to fire, whether that wildfire, whether managed retreat has been considered, but we're going to hear more from Mark Northcross later, as I mentioned, about risk insurance. So as this slide says, we have no investments with, we have no estimates with regards to adaptation investments. There's been a lot of work done on sea level rise adaptation, and I could throw out some billion-dollar numbers there. But when you add all these risks and hazards up, we still don't, we won't have a number. We may never have a number. All we know is it's going to be substantial. So available funding options for an adaptation response depend on the amount and type of investment needed. Knowing there's no data out there to answer the cost question, I'm going to take a stab at a relative metric, just to help us to get our help us get our heads around the challenges we face. In the table, what I mean by private is private property owners directly contributing to a public adaptation investment plan, such as through charges, assessments, or special taxes, typically through some type of financing district. By public, I mean all other types of public funding. For example, you're not going to fund a seawall out of a general fund revenues, nor are you likely to fund a tree trimming program with a GO bond. Likewise, you may require some private funding from those directly benefiting from flood mitigation through some type of financing district. I can't think of how a financing district might be used to increase resilience or mitigation for extreme heat or drought, unless some sort of maybe a microgrid or something like that as a backup power supply. So most of these investments are going to be more on the public side as opposed to private through some type of financing district. I'm estimating the mitigation of risks associated with sea level rise, inland flooding, and extended drought will require relatively more public infrastructure investment compared to wildfire and extreme heat. Given the size of these investments, debt financing will be needed in many cases. But these investments need to be amortized because these investments need to be amortized over longer periods. So also probability about the rate of climate change will be critical to their evaluation. Again, this question of uncertainty. On the other hand, I'm estimating that the mitigation of wildfire risk will require relatively less capital investment, but have significant ongoing costs for activities like vegetation management. So relatively less need for capital means, in the case of wildfire risk mitigation investment, means that you don't have some of the uncertainty issues. And unlike other climate risk, mitigation of wildfire must be done on all lands, public and private, to reap the benefits. So depending upon what hazard you're mitigating for and what level of investment, it's going to be a different set of funding streams. Okay, now I'm going to use a framework developed by Jesse Keenan in his book, Climate Adaptation Finance and Investment in California, which is probably some of the best work on this topic, and I appreciate the state funding that. The question the book addresses is how can we maximize our investments with our limited resources in responding to climate impacts. What we are doing here is developing for climate adaptation what utility and transportation managers have had for years. A well-established set of professional practices for developing capital improvement programs and other expenditure plans for consideration by decision makers. Keenan's framework involves three steps: project screening up front, funding options analysis, and strategic positioning of projects. This process is meant to be applied at the early stages of project planning and pre-development, so that you can take advantage of the knowledge base and maximize your ability to fund the project. So let's look at each of these in turn. So project screening tools, there are some basic tools you're probably well aware of. These involve benefit cost analysis, average annual loss or total avoided cost analysis, life cycle cost accounting, and return on investment. Advanced tools can help us resolve conflicting planning horizons, integral to many climate adaptation investments. For example, you may have debt repayment over 30 years, a useful life of an asset over 50, and yet long-term climate stressors that may continue for 100 years or more. These advanced tools help you also explicitly account for social equity. So these tools you can see here include things like real options analysis, multi-criteria analysis, social equity analysis, and triple bottom line. There is an even more unique aspect of adaptation that, again, as we've referenced, related to uncertainty. For this, we have tools sometimes referred to as tools for decision-making under deep uncertainty. We need these tools to integrate uncertainty with things like the rate of climate impacts, the rate of change in greenhouse gas emission levels or mitigation of those levels, and changes in engineering design standards and project costs as our society adapts to climate change. Here's a list of those. You don't need to be able to conduct project screening using these tools, but you do need to be able to understand them so you can effectively engage qualified outside resources to assist you in developing your climate adaptation investment strategies. Using these tools, we need to resist the tendency to optimize investment allocation in favor of economic productivity or local tax base and disregard the implications for disadvantaged communities. Social equity and triple bottom line tools help us ensure that social equity is integrated into this type of analysis. New York Times recently had an article on this topic, talked about shade in LA, where Mayor Garcetti is quoted saying shade is an equity issue. There's a program to plant over 90,000 shade trees by 2021. City did a database analysis of where the hottest bus stops are and plans to either put in shade or trees or some kind of cover for 750 of those. Still, funding will be difficult because funds for tree trimming were cut back during the last Great Recession by about 50%, and again, those funds will need to basically double in order to meet the goals the city has set out. So the challenge is to balance short and long-term interests and to maximize the range of beneficiaries over the greatest amount of time. Ultimately, these decisions should be informed, not dictated by the project screening tools I just discussed. Here's one of the advanced tools, tools for decision-making under deep uncertainty called Adaptation Pathways. In an Adaptation Pathways approach designed to schedule adaptation decision-making, it identifies decisions that need to be taken now versus those that can be deferred. It allows decision makers to plan for and prioritize and stagger adaptation investments. And the approach supports strategic, flexible, and structured decision making. I'm indebted to the work of Suzanne Mosier for this chart. The vertical scale represents magnitude of given climate impact. Horizontal scale represents time, and trigger points are noted in between. Here's another way to look at climate funding, adaptation funding, something that we emphasized in the Resilient by Design work that I was part of in the Bay Area, that was led by Mark Northcross, who you'll be hearing from later. The planning phase of a project results in general project description and possibly an order of magnitude cost estimate. We'll be discussing more later about how to fund this kind of work. I want to focus here is on the critical pre-development phase. This phase is where you get to maybe a 30% cost estimate. You've got a fairly good project description, and you're able now to start working with this project in the context of a larger plan. This phase is one of the hardest to fund because you're between plan and design and construction. But it supports the concepts that we're talking about today, and it's integral to doing good work in this area. Finally, there's the design and construction phase where there's lots of funds available. Well, lots, I mean, to the extent that there are intergovernmental funds, a lot of them are focused on design and construction. And so if you can get through the pre-development phase, you got a much better chance of being able to fund a project. A recent report by the Climate Safe Infrastructure Working Group for the state legislature that I also mentioned, highlight further in a few minutes, discussed this pre-development stage and the importance of expanding state funding for it. Here's another way that San Francisco has looked at revenue options. So this is a way of using what's called a heat map. As a final example, I'm using here to look at funding options analysis. The heat map is an example for the Seawall, is from the Seawall Financial Feasibility Report for the Port of San Francisco, a project that will require up to $5 billion in funding over the next 20 years. It's an effective tool for analyzing funding options using a range of criteria that aren't readily quantifiable. The heat map, you basically assign a scale of 1 to 5 based on the strength or weakness of a given funding source against a given criteria. The amounts are averaged on the right, and you end up with a ranking. Note that in this map, revenue generating potential is triple weighted for obvious reasons, so that affects the ranking. In this case, the type may be small to read, but you'll have this presentation when we finish today. Results indicate that Infrastructure Financing District ranked first, followed by Community Facilities District or Mello-Roos District, and then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer Grant Program. The fourth ranked funding option was interestingly a state property tax increment district that requires the state to participate in increment financing. There is a precedent for that in San Francisco, but that requires state legislation. Here's the rest of the table and the legend down to the right, down to the left. Finally, there's strategic positioning of projects. The first point about adaptation as a system and not just a project is going to come up more today. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to not think about projects in isolation of the systems in which they're working. If an adaptation investment is viewed in isolation as a freestanding project to direct a singular climate impact, you may miss the complements and conflicts associated with an otherwise seemingly unrelated project. For example, an urban forestry project that doesn't account for planned green stormwater infrastructure may miss cost efficiencies from implementation. Furthermore, many adaptation investments, as we will discuss in a minute, are part of ongoing investments to maintain and improve existing public assets. To this end, it is critical to examine how these disparate projects relate to one another. Here are some other strategic positioning points. Integrating adaptation into existing capital asset maintenance, which again we'll talk about in a second, stitching multiple projects together, looking for efficiencies and avoiding unnecessary redundancies, and linking cross-sector elements together, such as transportation, energy, and/or water systems. Here are some publications that you can turn to for further background in this work. We have Resilient by Design, the work from the Bay Area, the 9 design sites where international design teams put together an adaptation plan. Paying It Forward is probably the best work from the state, along with Climate Adaptation Finance Guide I mentioned by Jesse Keenan. These are available online for free, and they dig into these concepts in more detail. Now, at this point, you may wonder, yeah, that's great, but there's a lot of challenges here. And I don't want to gloss over the fact for local staff on the line how difficult this is. I can hear people saying I could do it if I just had the money. Now, many local agencies have begun the adaptation process, but though in still the very early stages. And as part of the Regional Climate Adaptation Framework, of which this work is about, ESA, a member of the team, looked at to what degree local agencies had integrated climate into their general plans. About 88 cities in the region have integrated to some degree climate change into their general plans, climate action plan, or a local hazard mitigation plan. The remaining 110 have yet to consider climate change or impacts at the plan level. And these 110 jurisdictions represent about 6.5 million people, or about a third of the region's population. So this study by the part of the state's 4th assessment, climate assessment, was done by Susan Mosier, and she looked at these barriers and through some polling realized that, yeah, lack of funding is typically what agencies bring up. But behind lack of funding are these other challenges listed here. You know, difficulty getting climate on the agenda, making the case, lack of knowledge about funding options. And in her report, there's a number of solutions to each of these, many of them applicable at the local level, and I encourage you to check it out to see if there are ideas for your jurisdiction. To wrap up this section, local climate action and adaptation plans can start with some pretty specific state guidance, as Nuantar has mentioned. There's guidance on hazard mitigation plans and general plan guidelines. At the local level, your climate adaptation plan has to relate to these other local plans. There's actually a funding point here that to access Office of Emergency Services funding, you need to have a local hazard mitigation plan to be eligible for pre-disaster mitigation grants or for post-disaster recovery assistance from the federal government. The local jurisdiction also must integrate or reference the LHMP and the safety element of the general plan to be eligible for the state to assist in providing the 25% non-federal match required for post-disaster funding. So this is critical work, and I encourage those of you that haven't gotten into it to start digging into it now. Finally, I've listed how these plans get implemented through zoning and building codes, CIPs, and the operating budget. So here are some funding resources for planning. Again, the slide deck you'll get, so you don't have to copy these down now, but there are some granted competitive but grant programs available for funding climate adaptation at the local level. There's also a great toolkit available, the Climate Capability Adaptation Toolkit, or ADAPT-CA. And this toolkit can help a community start to get their feet wet. It helps walk you through some of the basic steps, and then it has a way of advancing you to further steps as you're able to do that. Okay, we've got a moment for questions. Have any shown up? Okay. At this point, before I get into mainstreaming, any questions from the audience?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I always have a question. Seems. So you're talking about not focusing on the dollars so much initially, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, and looking at systems over, as a figure of merit. You talk about social equity, right, as a driver. So I was wondering what references we would have to bridging and transitioning from the current business as usual social equity systems we have in place and lack thereof, and then as far as really engaging this so that as a dynamic of climate change, allows us to shift, in that transitional space. Is the question kind of clear?
Well, there are tools that I reviewed, when you're looking at projects to integrate social equity concerns into determining where to invest, where to put the funding you've got. It's a challenge that's true across the board, though.
Understood. And as you look out the window, you can see some of, the effects of the business as usual stuff. And if you look down from the window, you can see the effects of some of the business as usual stuff. So I'm just kind of asking that because I see it as an opportunity as well as a challenge. Yeah. I just kind of raise it as a question.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think the point I would like to make is simply that when applying return on investment and these other project screening tools, to not get lost in the investment analysis, but to be clear about what the social equity values are that you're either acknowledging or not in that. And these tools these more advanced tools allow you to start doing that. So it's just, again, it's part of that muscle we're going to have to exercise as we move forward. Because if we don't, of course, the most vulnerable communities are least able to adapt to climate change. And so if everybody gets the same support, we're going to get business as usual. We're going to have to find a way to provide greater support for the most vulnerable communities in order to address the social equity goals we have. Okay, I've got a short section here before we get to the case studies. But in a way, an incredibly important section because it keys off of New and Tara's work regarding mainstreaming, as it's called, of climate adaptation investments. So let's start with another poll question. And I'm going to activate the poll around how much you might know about available funding. Wait a minute here. Is that the one I wanted? Hang on a second. This is the one I'd like to take on now. Any project in your current 5-year CIP that has an explicit climate adaptation component. So not, are you insulating a building that you would be doing anyway. But is there any spending you're doing now in your current CIP that has an explicit climate change component? I can see there we go. We have some yeses. The yeses have made it onto the scoreboard. Probably took longer for folks to understand exactly what they have in their CIP. But as we can see, no's make up most of it. And the point I'd like to make today is that those no's can be turning to yeses and without necessarily new funding. Let's go back. Back to the presentation. Here's some data that we got from the State Controller's Office. In 1 year alone, all the cities in the SCAG region are putting $3.7 billion into their CIP for projects and debt service. The 6 counties in this region, $1.1 billion. That's a lot of spending. Now, I don't mean to suggest that all of this is in any way related or could be related to climate adaptation. But I would suggest that as a local manager responsible for any component of your CIP, that you take a look at where you can integrate climate adaptation into your existing spending. You know, general government expenditures alone for counties, over 300 million. I gotta believe that there are some building rehab projects, infrastructure projects that are amenable to thinking through what can we do about adaptation, how can we use some of the project screening tools we've gone over to integrate adaptation to various hazards into those programs. And how might we do that? There's a report that'll be referenced in the back of the slide deck. By the way, all these references that I'm referring to here, the books and reports and everything, will be listed in the back of the slide deck for your use. From Union of Concerned Scientists about how to build climate-safe infrastructure in California. And they provided a nice way to think about it from an adaptation. You know, from the surveys we've done, we know that funding is an issue, but there are ways to get at this. So if we think about, say, a community center rehab or a substantial remodel, renovation of a community center, you know, at the planning and finance stage, you could think about vulnerabilities to extreme heat. At the design stage, you can look at should we be building in cool roofs or water or energy efficiency improvements. At the procurement stage, we could look at the materials we're selecting and whether they're amenable to extreme heat. At the once we're in operation, we can look at, well, what are we doing to enable this center to be available for maybe as a cooling center or as a resiliency hub. And then finally, when we talk about maintaining our facilities, what are we doing to keep them upgraded as climate impacts become more severe? So the point here is to look through your CIPs, look through your public assets, and see where we can start spending money we're already spending, but spending it in a smarter way on climate adaptation. Okay, now we're going to get into case studies, but I'd like to stop for a second, see if any questions have come in or, okay, any questions from the audience here? All right, I am going to turn it over now to Joseph Dieguez of the Cosmont Company.
All right, case studies. Thanks, Bob, and thanks to everyone for sticking with us. As Bob said, my name is Joe Dieguez. I am a senior VP with Cosmont. As folks may know, Cosmont's a real estate, economic development, public finance advisory firm since 1986, so a little over 33 years. I've been with the firm about a decade. I head what's known as the Special Districts and Infrastructure Funding Group within the firm. That's a lot of what I'll be talking about today. So to give some context, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is this first hexagon here, but I want to back up for a second and talk about sort of how we view the quote unquote economic development playbook. We know that folks here and on the webinar range in their roles from planning, community and economic development, folks in city manager's office, county CEO's office, finance, and we want to give a little bit of context, the offense and defense, as we call it. Again, what I'm talking a lot about today is this first hexagon of special district financing. This is mechanisms that allow a community to set aside funding to prioritize resiliency, transit supportive and housing supportive infrastructure, and housing itself with a variety of special districts, which I'll get into. And also what I'll talk about more is not only setting aside local funding, but a community setting itself up to attract funding from other agencies, other public agencies, locally and at the state and federal level. Sort of in parallel to that, we talk a lot about opportunity zones. Some, but not all jurisdictions may have these OZ census tracts within their jurisdiction. And part of the offense that we talk about a lot is proactively identifying and then promoting these opportunity sites for development or rehabilitation to the private sector, investment and development communities. On the defensive side, we recognize that a lot of our communities are facing with other things. Firstly, in the sort of land use and zoning side, they're responding to regulatory and market pressures. Regulatory pressures in the form, really a variety of forms, housing element compliance, compliance with things like accessory dwelling units, Surplus Land Act regulation, and really it's incumbent upon a lot of our communities to set themselves up zoning-wise, land use-wise to comply, but to also guide investment in light of market pressures for things like housing within their community. Alongside that, we know that a lot of our communities, along with prioritizing resiliency, they're feeling financial pressure, things like pension obligations. And so part of what we group in the defensive side of our playbook is, in some cases, refinancing that debt to take advantage of a low interest rate environment to generate some liquidity. Liquidity not just to build cash reserves, but to generate capital that can be deployed for things like resiliency and infrastructure projects, to head off things, also deferred maintenance, things that will become problems later on. They'll get worse with time if we don't sort of head them off now. And in that same category, talk about asset sales for many of our communities that own property within their communities. So like I said, I'm going to be focusing mostly today on that first hexagon of special districts and tax increment financing. This may be a review for a lot of folks with us here in person and online. Tax increment financing may sound familiar for those who are around in the days of redevelopment. This is the idea where you've got an assessed value baseline today within some boundary that you draw. And what one of these mechanisms allow you to do is set aside some portion of the future property tax revenues that comes from new value as existing value appreciates or as new projects come online entirely, generating assessed value increases. And local communities can set aside a portion, almost like a retirement account, set aside some portion of future funding and dedicate them for things like infrastructure, resiliency, and housing. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about tax increment financing. There are a variety of tools in the tax increment world. The one that you'll probably hear most often are enhanced infrastructure financing districts, EIFDs. You probably hear about them most because they, at least in Cosmont's opinion, they're the most versatile, the most flexible tools in terms of what they can pay for, that they can be non-contiguous. Some of the sort of quick highlights of the legislation are they're 45-year districts, they're long-term districts, and that's a clock, 45-year clock that doesn't really start ticking until you make an intention to issue debt. There's a new entity that governs an EIFD. It's called the Public Finance Authority. It's separate from your standard city council or county board governance-wise, but also important from a financial perspective. It's separate from the general fund, which has some important impacts for our finance folks in terms of insulating the general fund. They are, again, tax increment, so it's setting aside some portion of not current, but future property tax increment. And these districts have been really authorized to fund a variety of infrastructure, which I'll touch on, but there's this huge list in the law that starts with the words including but not limited to, and it's like 15 things. A lot of what you'll be familiar with: roadways, water, stormwater, transit supportive infrastructure, but certainly touch on things like sea level rise. That's why we're talking about it today. Just one thing that we'll touch on that will come up later on in Bob's notes is this continues to evolve, and we've seen another piece of legislation in October 2 months ago that changes the process. It was called AB 116. changes to process to form these districts. And I won't get into that too much. Suffice it to say that these things are evolving, and in our opinion, they're getting better and more flexible to do things like resiliency projects. I touched on briefly what they can fund. Here's just a sample from the legislation on the types of infrastructure that can be funded with these districts. This computer seems to be acting up. But among them, I talked about water, wastewater, sewer, transit supportive infrastructure, civic infrastructure, parks, open space. They even call out things like childcare facilities and brownfield remediation, and affordable housing as well. But certainly resiliency projects fall within that spectrum. So where are these things already happening? In a lot of communities statewide. Here's just a snippet of those that Cosmon's working on all across the state. And our point here is just that these vary entirely. Inland, coastal, urban, greenfield, the types of infrastructure being focused on, whether it's transit supportive, water, roadway, sea level rise, they truly do vary. And fortunately, the legislation has been crafted in a very flexible way to meet the needs of all different sorts of communities. Why are they compatible with resiliency? Well, first and foremost, the eligible expenditures include the types of projects that fall within the resiliency category. But aside from that, any sort of infrastructure investment often has to meet a sort of return on investment equation, specifically for our finance folks, for our city manager folks, county CAO folks. The idea is there needs to be a demonstration that investing in this type of infrastructure will somehow benefit the general fund over the long term. And these districts not only enable that to happen, but they're required to do things like fiscal impact analyses to demonstrate to any participating taxing entity what that return on investment is. They're also what we call a magnet for other public money, OPM, that's how we use the term, other public money in terms of potential tax increment matches from other taxing entities, as well as grants at the state and federal level. So it's not only setting aside local funds, but again, attracting other funds. I'll talk even more about that in a second. Importantly, from a sort of private sector perspective, these sorts of districts that are special purpose, again, separate from a city general fund, they really support investor confidence. Developers that work with cities a lot understand the difference between a special purpose entity with a dedicated revenue stream and a line item in a budget that may change with the future administration, and that might have significant impacts for their private development project, which may be relying on certain types of infrastructure in order to go in. These are evolving tools. I mentioned just 2 months ago, there was a piece of legislation that changed the way EIFDs are formed, but we see these continuing to get more flexible, more useful, more applicable to a lot of the communities that we're talking about. They also serve well to sort of bundle other revenues. They're equipped to sort of compile a variety of funding sources and deploy them to specific projects, whatever the targeted projects are that are spelled out very clearly in what's called their infrastructure financing plan. And lastly, it's important to distinguish tax increment from things like community facilities districts, business improvement districts, other sorts of districts that add a tax on the property tax bill. When we're talking about tax increment, this is not an additional assessment that an owner will see on their bill. And that's important for residents, property owners, and businesses. This is a local community, a taxing entity choosing to voluntarily set aside some portion of future revenue that prioritizes infrastructure, resiliency, housing, whatever the target investments of their district may be. A little bit more about the other funding sources. So it varies by community, which other funding sources can be attracted. Those can be in the communities that I mentioned that may have opportunity zone census tracts. These are very compatible overlays that, you know, opportunity zone investors are incentivized by a federal tax code incentive, a capital gains deferral or complete elimination incentive. And these districts that are property tax oriented, they take time to generate. Assessed value needs to increase before these districts have any funding to expend. And where there's an OZ overlay, that's investment on the private side that's already incentivized to come in early, which in turn generates property tax increment for these districts. I also talked about matching in terms of grant sources. It's a variety of grant sources at the state and federal level, which are really prioritizing applications from these EIFDs because they're special purpose entities. They can only do infrastructure and housing. And that application looks much better, as you can imagine, if you've got local agencies partnering, like a city and a county under one EIFD. So in that way, these are serving as boosts for grant applications. A lot of the areas that may be interested in resiliency projects also have disadvantaged community census tract overlap, which in themselves have priority for grants such as those funded by cap and trade proceeds. And then there are other funding sources that can be looped in. I won't go into too much detail, but things like development agreements, contributions from private sector developers, or impact fees, or other resources at the local level. The study specifically that we wanted to talk about briefly is in Redondo Beach here in LA County. This is an EIFD, an Enhanced Infrastructure Financing district around a little power plant, an AES power plant, if you can believe it or not. And it's still there today. The vision is to remove it and to turn it into a regional open space, wetlands open space, to remediate the site, install some socially equitable amenities, and also have some private investment on the site, which I'll talk about. But the idea here, the objective, is that this is a city-county partnership, which is significant in the world of these districts, to really turn around a contaminated prime waterfront property into some private development, but also some very beneficial public amenities. The site we're talking about, the power plant itself sits on about 50 acres, and then what's been grouped into the district is some SCE right-of-way, some utility right-of-way that has some huge power lines that would benefit from being undergrounded to relieve some visual blight. But overall, about 90 acres, not a lot of property owners, less than 9 property owners. Some of the things I want to point out, that's being decommissioned. This power plant is already being decommissioned, so it's not authorized to operate beyond December of next year. AES, the owner of the power plant, has been marketing the site, and there's already discussion with a potential buyer, a private sector developer. And so there's sort of a public investment and private investment arm of this strategy. The public investment is creating this regional park. That's the key aspect of it, but also some wetlands restoration and other recreational amenities. And the private development side, alongside of it, would be some resort hotels, some retail and restaurants to go along with it. The goals really are to take advantage of the private investment side of things, which are going to increase assessed value, and to channel those funds for targeted infrastructure improvements. Utility relocation, the cleanup, the park itself. I should mention also that sort of a parallel part of this strategy, when I talked about grants, this is a good case study. Prop 68 open space and park grants. I think of about $5 million, I'm not sure if it's on the slide, but about $5 million for this project. The city council adopted a resolution of intention to form this district in April earlier this year. And in a big move, the Los Angeles County Supervisor just passed last month their resolution of intent to partner with the city in this district. And any of the communities who've been working on these sorts of districts know it's a big move when you can get a city and a county on board together. So it's a strategy of both city and county property tax increment, as well as the $5 million Prop 68 grant. The private investment that I'm talking about, the important fact is you're talking about hotel, restaurant, retail investment that totals on range of magnitude wise about $200 million of private sector investment, which creates funding that can be deployed for infrastructure. And the types of infrastructure we're talking about in this case study are, again, that wetlands restoration, the regional park itself, the removal of those massive utility lines that create visual blight, recreational and cultural amenities, but also improving some bike and pedestrian connectivity to get folks to the beach. So I'm going to pause there. I think Bob is going to help sort of tie this together with the overall resiliency framework, but I certainly look forward to answering folks' questions a bit later on. Thank you.
Well, let's take some questions now. Any questions for Joe?
Yeah, I do. So I actually live in Redondo.
Cool.
So I've been following this. And I just want to make sure before I said anything. So the PUC is looking at extending that in the Huntington Beach one till 2023, right? Yeah,
I'm not familiar with the Huntington.
I understand, okay. But because of the peaker plant capacity it has. Not to take away anything from what you're saying, because it's either now or later. So that's just a data point that you might want to look at in what you're doing. I do have a question. The question was, all good stuff. What happens as a contingency if the money that's being sequestered in the future is needed for other things in the future? What kinds of things are in? I know there's a lot of people working on this. I'm not pretending to know what I'm talking about. So I just asked the question.
Yeah, totally. So the idea is to write this plan. It's called the Infrastructure Financing Plan that very clearly identifies where the money is going to come from, how much it's going to be, and what you're going to spend the money on. But no one can predict the future. So there is a process outlined in the legislation to amend these things as time goes on. Quite frankly, if things change and the market changes, there are climate events that can change things. So the plan can be amended is the short answer. The only time where funds are truly tied up if there were a bond issuance, where then you're in a situation where you set up an obligation to pay your bondholders. And then you're sort of in a scenario, the closest analogy we have is redevelopment dissolution, where some agencies have this list of the ROPS items, recognized obligation payment schedule, of obligations that they have to pay for before they dissolve. That would be the closest analogy. But many of these won't be, I don't think I know we haven't seen the first tax increment bond issuance yet for one of these districts. I think the first time we'll see one is probably fiscal year 2022, 2023. That's a good question.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Jennifer from the city of Long Beach. Can you give a better idea of the process of between like studying, approval, and being able to use the tax assessment? What does that look like from when you started exploring this? Is that time getting shorter for cities?
It is, yeah. Yeah, so these range, I'd say, in complexity. The biggest determinant of how long these take is how many agencies are involved. Like if it's a city going solo, let's say Long Beach decided to do it solo, maybe 12 months would be your timeline from beginning to end. Studying it, sort of educating, communicating with your stakeholders. There are required series of public hearings now, post AB 116, as of 2 months ago, series of public hearings that have to be spaced apart 30 days, where you've got to explain your plan, then start taking some community input, and there's actually a protest opportunity. The blanket level answer is 12 months, maybe on a city solo approach. But let's say if Long Beach wanted to talk to Los Angeles County about kicking in some of its share, we have found that to be an extension of that timeline. Maybe that's 18 months now, because there's the supervisorial staff, there's the local administrative staff at the county that has to truly understand the picture, and very importantly, what's in it for them. What's the regional benefit? What's the fiscal return on investment for the county general fund? So yeah, a series of steps, resolutions that need to be made, and a series of public outreach, public meetings that are mandated by the legislation. Yeah, and sorry, the part about when the funding becomes available, it's tax increments. So year one, or years, when you first form it, you've got zero revenue. There's no increased assessed value beyond your baseline. So the earliest we would expect to see enough funding to actually issue a bond would be probably year 3 after formation.
Yeah, so I have one quick question. On your slide where you were comparing the table with EIFDs and compatibility to resilience, and you're talking about the ROI, return on investment, I'm curious if there's a way to look at or to quantify avoided future loss or risk mitigation, because I think one of the key components to incorporating future climate risk is understanding, what are those risks? And yes, there is some uncertainty, but actually there's a lot of certainty in terms of the direction, like extreme heat is going to go up, sea level rise will rise, those kind of things. So I'm wondering if there's a way to actually in EIFDs incorporate avoided future loss from climate risks into how you're thinking about return on investment.
Yeah, that's probably one of the areas where we can stand to improve a lot in these districts, demonstrating that ROI. A lot of different levels of conversation that go on forming these things. There's the elected official level, there's the finance director level, and then we have a lot of interesting conversation at the public works director sort of level, where those folks are the ones that tend to have the best feel for what sort of cost down the line am I avoiding? And when we have touched on it, it's actually been those folks at the city and county level that have actually helped us to make the case internally. They have the best sense of what are the potential costs going in down the line. We often don't coming in from the outside. So that kind of information often best gets generated from within. But I think it belongs in many of these plans, particularly those that are going after resiliency objectives. Yeah.
Okay, Thanks very much. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, with regards to that last question, that's one of the biggest challenges with this work is adaptation is investing money so that something doesn't happen. And there's no way the financial markets are going to give you any return on that. And there's no way your tax increment, you can borrow against that. I mean, eventually when it doesn't happen, your increment will be higher. Well, then you can borrow, but you've had to already finance your adaptation. So it is it's a challenge in this field. It's a challenge that we have to make to our decision makers and to the public, that we need to make these investments so that things don't happen. So let's see if we take this case study and put it through Jesse Keenan's analysis. You know, project screening, clearly there's a decision-making under uncertainty that's going to be going on here as the rate of sea level rise occurs on this coastal property. And so investments by the EIFD are going to have to consider sea level rise projections, how fast they're occurring, what probability do we want to assign to those, and what investments are we going to make, and what trigger points might lead us to have to make additional investments. Funding options, this idea of systems and not projects comes up again. There are multiple beneficiaries when you can link your project into a system. We've got industrial reuse, we've got regional park wetland restoration, we have sea level rise mitigation. All of these increase the range of funding sources. EIFDs also provide a very flexible funding focused on capital projects, but that's an advantage of an EIFD, is a great degree of flexibility. And then in terms of strategic positioning, I think a question for the EIFD is going to be how you integrate those projects in an area-wide sea level rise adaptation plan. All right, now we're going to turn to adaptation for fire risk. And I want to see if we have Mark Northcross on the line.
Hey, Bob, Mark here. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you perfectly, Mark. Why don't you let me know if you want some help advancing the slides, and you can take it away.
Okay, let's do that. Let's move to the first text slide in my presentation, and which is titled California's Fire Insurance Challenge.
Yep, we're there.
We're there, great. So I suspect the people either on the call or in the room are familiar with this in some respects. So let's just do a little recap. $35 billion in losses from wildfires in the last 2 years. An interesting factoid I got from an extremely credible source. I think it finally actually became semi-public. These losses of $35 billion exceed the combined profits of California's admitted fire insurers for the last 25 years. This is a startling fact, and I can say that behind closed doors, you have actuaries for the admitted carriers are wondering if their employers can ever recover from this loss. And having internal people in the insurance company put that question on the table is a serious public policy issue as well, as you can imagine. The last count we got from the Department of Insurance was approximately 350,000 policies not renewed so far this year. Are we going to get more in 2020? The bets are the pace of non-renewal is accelerating. So are we going to end up with the next outcome, which is admitted insurers considering not writing policies in California's wildland urban interface are leaving the state? Well, the Department of Insurance Commissioner Laura put a moratorium in non-renewal. We'll talk about that. Hopefully everyone on this webinar is familiar with FAIR, which is the state's insurance program of last resort. It's essentially paid for as I'll call it an assessment or a tax on the admitted carriers. It's a great program. It's very limited. It's designed to meet your minimum insurance requirements to get a home mortgage in order to have, get a commercial mortgage, as the case may be. The question on the table that a lot of people are talking about is whether or not it's scalable. I think the answer is it is not scalable in its present form. It would take an intervention by the state again and a legislative fix to make it scalable to deal with the volume that may be coming as far as fire insurance. The other piece, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and you saw that map that Bob put up for the SCAG region on fire hazard, is a mass loss of fire insurance by homeowners in 2020 would disrupt the real estate market. And I'll jump ahead to a slide, I'll address this. We really believe that the key deliverable here politically is probably going to be stability in the real estate market. So hold that thought. Bob, let's go to the next slide. State's response so far.
Got it.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, what has the state done? Well, earlier this year, there was a work for the CPUC, the governor's office, the investor-owned utilities to put $24 billion into a loss reserve for fire claims. Okay, that's a good thing, but it's for the utilities. Doesn't really address going forward the fire risk or the insurance issue. The state finally approved legislation to create a diversion from the $1.5 billion cap and trade revenue program to go to CAL FIRE, well-spent money. The legislation was flexible to allow an allocation of this money for local fire mitigation, but how much of that, if any, has gone to local fire risk mitigation, I don't know. And maybe there's somebody on this webinar who does know, but that's a question mark right now, as far as I know. As I mentioned, the insurance commissioner put a 1-year moratorium on non-renewal of fire policies in recent wildfire impacted zip codes. I do know with firsthand knowledge, in fact, I just came out of a room where it was being discussed, and I'm in a parking garage in Sacramento for the record. The state is seriously talking about intervening to buy reinsurance. That's like wholesale high-level insurance for those who aren't familiar with insurance industry terms for the admitted carriers for fire insurance in California. The California Earthquake Authority has been buying reinsurance very adeptly for years, and they're really good at it, and they know all the global carriers and all that. So that's under consideration, and that's a really good thing. Bob, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so, but it's not just the losses that you talk to insurers that they cite for as the challenge to staying in California. And again, I want to reiterate, behind closed doors, the insurers will tell you they are seriously considering whether or not they can afford to stay in California. That question is on the table. Number one, inability to use what they call CAT models to price premiums. Legally, they can do it in California. The Department of Insurance has not allowed them to do that. I'm not going to go into the weeds on why. They have some good reasons, but there are also very good reasons. If you want to keep insurers in California, we've got to find a way to allow what they call CAT models to be used for pricing homeowners insurance. Admitted carriers, primary carriers, are also right now prohibited from pricing the reinsurance costs into their premiums. Again, that's not a statutory problem, it's a policy issue. Key issue, and I'll jump ahead, Florida is a great case study and a teaching story for how to deal with the issues we're facing now, not because of fire, but because of hurricane. Florida dealt with the near collapse of their insurance industry and the huge disruption in the real estate market after Hurricane Andrew. Through many ways, one of the key ways was insurance, reinsurance, and essentially the windstorm risk. When you look at fire risk, kitchen fires burn one home, they don't burn 1,000. When we have these windstorms and a fire, that's when it just goes to catastrophic and you end up with these horrific situations. So the fire risk that really is the challenge is when you've got fire and a wildfire and wind behind it. Finally, everyone wants fire risk mitigation. There really is not a viable statewide funding program for that. There's been a number of local jurisdictions that have adopted 2/3 vote property tax increases in effect to fund it, but that's not the scale ultimately we need. So that's a question that's on the table. Bob, next slide.
Oops.
Okay, the Florida teaching story. Slide before that. I don't,
Oh, there we go.
Because Florida went
Yep.
through. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Florida had a 6.5-year moratorium on non-renewals. What it had the effect of doing is nobody could buy a home in Florida that required hurricane insurance because the insurers contracted their business by not writing new policies for home buyers. And so the Florida experience applied to what Commissioner Lara, who I have a great deal of respect for, just did, is that it may have a real adverse impact on the real estate market, that the homeowners insurers may stop writing policies for home buyers. By peril means that you really need to address the fire risk when the wind is blowing hard. And that is I'm getting into insurance industry terminology and jargon, but that means basically you're writing a specific peril. You're focusing on how you deal with fire when there's a wind blowing. And that essentially is done through the reinsurance industry. Finally, again, what Florida did, they set up a statewide vehicle to get reinsurance for hurricanes. And it's been very, very successful. And they set up a whole process to allow what we call CAP models to be used for pricing hurricane insurance in Florida. So next slide. This slide brings us back to, we've got local government on the call, we've got regional government on the call. This is a really important slide. There is an aspect of fire risk insurance during windstorms that's all or nothing, and it completely separates insuring this particular risk from hurricanes, earthquakes, flood, and all the other kinds of risk. What it comes down to, I'm just going to really summarize this chart, is that if your home is on a standard suburban density lot size, you know, say 6,000 to 7,000 square feet, 15 feet setbacks, whatever, what the actuaries from the insurance companies are telling their bosses, based on reviewing what has happened in California in the last 2 years of windstorms, is that it does not matter how hardened the insured property that your name is on is. If the unhardened homes next to your insured property burn, your insured property will burn no matter what. External sprinkling, ember control, defensible space, go down the list. It does not matter if the properties next to it at a suburban density are not hardened. This, when you look at earthquake insurance as an insurer, you don't care whether the neighbors strapped their water heaters or bolted their foundation. When you look at flood insurance, you don't care what the neighbors did to protect their property. Or a hurricane, did they do all the things to their roof and all that? You don't care what the neighbors did. When it comes to wildfire and windstorm insurance, you care. That puts fire risk mitigation for windstorms in California into a unique category that we have not dealt with before, where it may, can't say it will, decisions haven't been made yet, it may end up being an all or nothing situation where either the entire neighborhood is fire hardened or nobody gets insurance. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I can tell you with good authority that question is being discussed seriously by the fire insurers. Questions on the table. What the outcomes are going to be, I have no idea. Next slide, Bob. Opportunity, broad outline of the solution. We'll skip the graphic on the bad fire. So number one, Department of Insurance allows use of CAP models for windstorm risk pricing. One of the questions on the table when you look at reinsurance and building that for windstorms, for wildfire, wind-driven wildfire reinsurance, do you do it on a state level or you do it on the regional government level? really interesting question. I'll talk about it a little bit, but I just want to get the question on the table. The California Earthquake Authority is the logical choice to go out and deal with reinsurance for windstorms. They've been doing it for earthquakes for years. They know all the players globally, and they do a great job. But on the other hand, there's a number of reasons why you may want to really handle your fire program at a regional level. Fire risk mitigation is really at a local government level, and I'll go into the reasons why, though I suspect people on the webinar already know why it's at a local level. But these two bold-faced points I really want to make. The key deliverable is not fire risk mitigation. The key deliverable is sustainable fire insurance. And it sounds like I'm saying something that's really, obnoxious and controversial, but the reason why is that politically what's going to drive this is disruption of the real estate market. And the way you keep the real estate market stable is by having sustainable fire insurance, particularly available to home buyers. So that means that when you think about, and one of the other pieces that goes on behind the scenes is that, and I can't explain why, but fire marshals and insurance company actuaries do not always see eye to eye as to what fire hardening is right and what matters. They have different opinions on that. And I totally respect our first responders and fire marshals on fire safety, but the insurance company actuaries are the ones we got to convince if we want to have sustainable fire insurance. So just a heads up for everybody on the webinar, when you get into the weeds on this, you may find your fire marshal and your fire insurer not seeing things eye to eye as to what matters. Next slide, Bob. So what's the state role? I've already kind of covered that. It really is, number one, you may have to carve out the wind-driven wildfire risk from the standard homeowners insurance policy and work out a whole special coverage program for that. That's what Florida ended up doing. And maybe we don't do that in California, but the successful teaching story from Florida is that you carve out, in that case, the hurricane risk from the standard homeowners policy, and you build a standalone program to deal with that statewide. So that's the success story we have. That's the model. Florida created a state entity to manage all that. Essentially, they took sort of like their equivalent of FAIR and the California Earthquake Authority sort of married them and scaled them up big time. So that may be the model, but that's our success story for the closest model I can come up with nationally. And so I'm not saying it has to be the way it is in California, but I think you start with what you know worked, and then you try to figure out if you need to change it. Again, Florida created the good public policy issue why the state is uncomfortable with CAP models, as we nickname them, is for the same reason when you look at all the modeling that was done for, you watch that movie, The Big Short, where all this Standard & Poor's and Moody's were modeling all these home mortgage bonds, and the models said AAA, and they all went into default. Models are very complicated. So what the Department of Insurance is not equipped to vet a CAP model for accuracy and appropriateness and fairness. Florida had the same problem. They created a whole state entity whose sole job was to vet CAP models. Again, not saying we have to do that in California, but that's a success story. Again, maybe you want to have regional government in California authorized to intervene and deal with the windstorm fire risk. Finally, echoing what Joseph was saying, and I know Larry Cosmon hopefully is still in the room there, has been working on very hard for years, you need, I believe, to do fire hardening at the local level, which is not just existing homes, it's community scale, it's neighborhood scale, dealing with the all or nothing risk we have inherent in this. You need the equivalent of EIFDs or geologic hazard abatement districts that are built around fire hardening. We don't have that legislation right now. Bob, next slide. So we're talking to people at SCAG, and I see someone from SANDAG, I think, is on the line as well. SCAG's got a population larger than there are only a few states that got more people in it than SCAG. SANDAG is pretty large. SACOG, ABAG, they got a lot of people. You got scalability. You got volume. You could run, reinsurance programs. You could run a Florida type program through any of these major regional governments in California. You've got the scale. The political issue that arises, and I'm again saying this is not a recommendation or even a suggestion, but it's a question, is that we in California, both the local and the regional level, tend to get really bent out of shape when there's a state mandate. And again, this all or nothing aspect to fire risk mitigation puts this mandate question squarely on the table. And are you better dealing with the mandates at a regional and local level than at the state level? I don't know, but that question is really seriously at the table. And we're very likely, in my opinion, to have to deal with some level of mandates to solve this problem. And it's not just buying reinsurance, it's dealing with the fire hardening. So is there a role for regional government? And obviously the fire risk and the real estate market disruption risk vary considerably by region in California. So regionally sensitive solutions may be crucial. Bob, next slide. I sort of covered this, but what is fire risk mitigation? What are the key elements? You certainly have got building code enforcement, and I have to say zoning, and this is the managed retreat question, going prospectively in the future. There are a whole bunch of things we can do. I'm not the person to go into the weeds on that. That's not my expertise, and I'm sure people on this call have already been through that and know a lot about that. The question that's on the table is a retroactive mandate. Again, going back to that dreaded all or nothing slide I had a few slides back, this fire thing is, if it's an all or nothing situation, we are staring at the possibility of retroactive mandates, cram downs on homeowners to improve their property, or you end up with I'll put an example on the table. You have an elderly couple, they've paid off their mortgage. And their place from a fire hardening standpoint is a disaster. And nobody in their neighborhood can get fire insurance because of that home. I'm not saying that's happening. I don't think it's happening yet, but that's a possibility that we may be into that situation. That question is on the table. And if it is, how do you deal with it? It is a social and political problem of the first magnitude. Again, finally, just echoing back to what Joseph and Larry have put on the table, we need some legislative fixes to create the authority and the funding source to do fire hardening at a neighborhood and community scale, and perhaps on a home-by-home scale. Next slide, Larry. Again, the building code piece. The scary part really is the retroactive question. I really advise everyone listening to this to start sitting with that, because that is a possibility. It may land on us. It's going to be a cultural and political challenge, the likes of which, to my knowledge, we have not really dealt with in California before. I refer to the Boulder Plan. This goes back to the question that fire marshals and insurance actuaries don't always see risk the same way. Boulder County, Colorado basically got the fire marshals and the insurance company actuaries into a room together for a year and developed a synchronized, comprehensive system for, if you do this punch list, 3 insurers will actually write you a policy. So it's very innovative. It is, again, a teaching story that we need to look to in California. And finally, I'm being redundant here, but implement community scale GADs and EIFDs. That's not something that you're going to be doing at state level. You might be able to do it at a regional government level, but certainly local government is where that lives. And that's the end of my presentation, although I sure like the following slide showing the benefit cost ratio with the SCAG region really popping out.
Well, I'll move to that slide, Mark, and give it a short explanation while people think of any questions they might have for you. So speaking to the value of these building codes and even the retroactive question, this comes out of a National Institute of Building Sciences study, and it looks at the application of the 2015 International Wildlife Urban Interface Building Code and what the benefit cost ratio would be. That's the BCR there scale in the lower right. And although it picks the census tract in the county with the highest BC ratio, it's indicative of what's going on in the entire county. And you can see there in Southern California, that's just about the SCAG region. If you added in Imperial County, a BC ratio of greater than 6. In other words, you get $6 back for the cost of a homeowner or whoever ends up paying the building code upgrades. You get $6 back for every $1 you put into this international WUI code. All right, any questions for Mark?
Yeah. So, Mark, first of all, thank you for your presentation. My name is Jeff Newman. I'm from Caltrans. The regionally funded retroactive fire mitigation, I wonder if there's an analogy to regionally or statewide or locally funded retrofitting for earthquakes. You know, the
I think
fire
that's
stuff. Go ahead.
I think that's a very good analogy. We've only had, here's the difference, it's scalability. GADs, that's what they were created for, and they're used for other things, but certainly they've been used, the extent they've been used, I think it's been mostly been seismic. And so the question is, you've got a scattering of GADs around California, and where they've been used and very successful, but very limited scale. You know, the rumor has it that the insurance industry has classified 25% approximately of California homes as being in the WUI for a windstorm, wildfire risk. I mean, the windstorm-driven risk. You're talking, 7 figures here in homes. How do you scale up on that? And that question has not been addressed. But yes, I think it's a good example, and what we need to focus on is the scalability.
So in that regard, the other question I had was, you were talking about the validation of the CAP models, right? And
yeah.
you were speaking to the challenge that would be done at a statewide rather than, or mix and match to regional/local level. The availability of the reinsurance through the validated CAP models allows maybe for the scaling, but the question is how much time, and it's an open question and probably an unfair question, how much time do you think it might take to gain confidence in validating those at a regional and local level, given the capacities of organizations there? No offense to anybody.
I think that's a totally spot on question. And what I'm going to come back with is kind of, I'm going to make a political prediction, and based on talking about with people in Florida as to what drove their creative and sustainable solution for hurricane. All praise to them. It's the real estate market. It's the board of realtors. So my prediction, and maybe I'm wrong, probably will be wrong, but is that when the real estate industry is going to Sacramento and saying, save us, help us, we can't sell properties anymore, amazing resources will become available, and we will move mountains to find a solution. But until then, I'm not sure we got the will or the funding to go deal.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. We're going to have to move on. Thanks very much, Mark, for the call in from the Sacramento parking lot.
You're welcome.
All right. We'll be in touch. All right. Let's move through a couple other case studies here fairly quickly so we can wrap up before 4 o'clock and save some time for Q&A. The Salt Beach Salt Marsh segment sediment augmentation project is a wetland restoration project that combines, it's the first of its kind on the West Coast. I should make that point. What it's using is taking dredge sediment from the nearby harbor that Orange County Parks needs to maintain and applying a thin layer of about 10 inches over 10 acres of marsh and monitoring the accumulation. The idea is, can we apply sediment and have a marsh actually grow over time? This will test a sea level rise and climate change adaptation strategy that can be used at regular intervals to ensure long-term sustainability of Pacific Coast marshes and protect properties as well. So funding came about 50% construction from the state, and you can see in the chart. And most of it, the local funding came from in-kind contributions from Orange County Rec and Park, and the federal government funded about a third of it as well because of the importance of this example of marsh restoration and sea level rise. So again, our framework, there's still deep uncertainty we're dealing with in terms of the amount of sea level rise, and I think in the Bay Area where I'm from, this is a big deal because these marshes still, in spite of how much we filled the bay, there are still many around the bay, and it's unclear whether we will be able to build them up fast enough to meet the rate of sea level rise. So again, dealing with uncertainty is a challenge. In terms of funding options, this is a great example of leveraging local funding in the way of Orange County Parks for state and federal funds. This is also a great example of a system where you're generating multiple beneficiaries by taking harbor maintenance costs that Orange County Parks would have anyway and using them for sea level rise mitigation and getting wetland benefits out of it. So when you do this kind of mix and matching, generating multiple beneficiaries, you can generate a broader range of funding options. Question I have here is that sometimes there can be a misalignment of funding criteria. And I know we're looking at this in the Bay Area as well, the same kind of project where there's already ocean disposal, and that capital equipment's already amortized and paid for. So when you come into the Army Corps with a grant application, but you've got to spend some on capital, they're going to get you to amortize that over 2 years. Well, it's crazy to amortize capital equipment of this type over 2 years, but it puts these new and innovative type of projects at a disadvantage when you've got ocean-going disposal and your ocean-going disposal dredge is already bought and paid for. And then finally, of course, integrating this into an area-wide sea level rise adaptation plan will be critical. Then I want to touch on the Orange County groundwater replenishment system. This is, in a way, the granddaddy of groundwater replenishment. Now I'm into the extreme drought arena here. It's the world's largest advanced water purification system, the GWRS. It takes highly treated wastewater that would normally have been discharged into the Pacific Ocean, purifies it in a three-step process, cleans it up further and injects it back into the ground. What this does is provide a barrier to sea intrusion, as well as and maintain the groundwater basin in Orange County, and at the same time replenishing that groundwater basin. So this started actually back in the mid-90s before climate adaptation was even on the books, but it's been accelerated as a result of projections of extreme drought. So this is a great example of how we can leverage these local funds again for state and federal funding. Although most of this funding is local, the financing came from state and federal sources. So that was a critical piece of being able to get this done. In terms of our framework, there's more decision-making under uncertainty. Here it's the rate of availability of external water supplies. So how you project that will affect your benefit cost ratio. This is an example of full adaptation, back to one of the earliest slides, where you're creating a perennial local water source. So that went from an investment standpoint, that means you can amortize costs over a long period. Funding options, again, looking at a system and not just a project. You've got multiple beneficiaries that are able to combine their resources, in this case, the water district and the wastewater district. The low-cost intergovernmental financing was very helpful here. This was through the infrastructure bank at the state level, and also EPA has a similar financing facility to provide financing at low cost. So that was a big deal. And then applying the ability of utilities to use their ability to raise revenues with simply a majority vote of their board, as long as there is a majority protest. This is a case where new revenue was brought to the table because through utilities that have a more streamlined ability to do that. No public vote required, in other words. So that plays a big role in any utility adaptation process. And I'll come back to that towards the end of the presentation. And finally, you know, can this project be scaled? Can it be expanded? And how do you position it for the future? Okay, the last case study is on the San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District. This district, I think, is the first of its kind in the country in terms of a county-wide special district devoted to climate adaptation. Why? Because $34 billion of property is at risk of being flooded by 2100, both on the bay side and the coast side of this county. This county has both problems, if you will. And almost $1 billion of property is at risk from coastal erosion. This county, San Mateo County, has the most people and property at risk for sea level rise. So there's a driver. Community leadership was provided by Congresswoman Jackie Spear, so that was quite helpful as well. How is this going to be structured? On the governance side, there's a existing flood control district that's being modified by state legislation, which has been passed and signed by the governor. Going to create a 7-member board that includes officials from the city and the county rather than simply a dependent flood control district governed by the Board of Supervisors. And the process is really through project by project MOUs, as it's called, memorandums of understanding, where local governments and other agencies will come together around individual projects and use the district for planning and implementation. The district's first task will be to develop an integrated sea level rise resiliency investment plan, although there's some tension there I'll get to. And then the next biggest thing is to secure some long-term funding. They've got some startup funding I'll discuss, but long-term funding still remains a question. And then continue to support implementation of projects as they come up, new projects for sea level rise. So I think what's great about this is it provides a countywide shell for local agencies through local initiative and local control to come forward and cooperate with an entity that can help stitch things together, back to stitching together projects. And of course, leveraging state and federal funding will be a lot easier if you can do it at a countywide level. So how are they doing this funding-wise? They've got $1.5 million per year for the first 3 to 5 years. You can think of this as seed funding or initial funding. About 50% is coming from the county, 50% from the cities. And you can see here how it's broken out. There's 3 tiers for the cities based on population, contributing anywhere from $25,000 to $55,000 a year. Relatively modest sums, but not inconsequential in our strained fiscal environment. The county is providing the other 50%, $750,000 to get to the $1.5 million a year. Then ongoing, there will be additional revenues coming in associated with individual projects. Also, there is existing funding going to the district, but that's going to be dedicated to the existing flood control responsibilities of the district that's being terminated. And there's also $1.8 million in fees and charges dedicated to the county water pollution control program. So the agency is going to have additional responsibilities, but that existing funding is spoken for. So how, if you're the district, they're hiring for an executive director right now, if anybody's interested, actually, and would like to move to San Mateo. I'm sure you can find the job posting online. They're looking not only for an engineer, but a finance expert, somebody that not only can manage flood control, but also go out and raise new monies. So it's a very challenging position. But again, I think it speaks to a model of what we might want to think about at our county and regional level. So they've got ongoing funding needs and one-time funding needs. And they've got a district administration, advanced planning, pre-development, design and construction, and O&M for their projects. They're going to have to find a general tax for an ongoing source. And they're primarily going to look at either a parcel tax or maybe an EIFD to do that. So that's going to require going to the voters of San Mateo County and getting that 2/3 vote in the case of a parcel tax, not in the case of an EIFD, and getting folks to realize that this is an important investment to make. The one-time monies for pre-development, some of those pre-development monies will probably be needed to be funded out of the general tax, but some will be more closely associated with individual project, where you can rely on those MOU participants to pick up that funding need, cities, agencies, utility districts, et cetera, and state and federal grants. And then those ongoing costs, which are often forgotten about, but are incredibly important as we look at maintaining our levees up in the Sacramento Delta and the dangers that those old levees are under and risk to earthquake because of a lack of maintenance. There's going to be some, I would suggest, and I'll say these are my ideas, not the district. The district starts January 1, so there is no district yet to claim any of this. I think that they need to move towards some kind of local fee or charge for those beneficiaries of those flood control projects. So who's ever the direct beneficiary probably should end up in some kind of an assessment district or related district to make sure that those flood control improvements are maintained and maintain their effectiveness over time. So here are some of the options. Parcel tax with $10 a year, they could raise $2.1 million. That's more than their annual seed funding. There's a hotel tax that's being considered by one of the communities on the Bay side because there's some hotel development anticipated within areas susceptible to sea level rise, and putting a surcharge on that hotel tax would both protect those hotels and be a proper use of those funds in protecting and applying to sea level rise projects for those properties. I've talked to staff of the Public Works Department of the county. They're looking at an enhanced infrastructure financing district. Of course, as I think Joe reviewed, that's taking money out of your future increment that would go to your general fund and putting it into this different pot. So you got to make a conscious decision that you're willing to reallocate there. It's also a question of whether you could get the cities to agree to the same kind of reallocation. But when we looked at it, even with just the 2% annual growth, and actually tax increment in the county is growing at 5 to 7% a year, but even at that minimal Prop 13 2% amount, $300 million would be generated over 45 years if you just took 1% of the revenue that would have gone to those general funds and allocated to this district. So 1% of the general revenues you would have gotten from that increment, put it in this district, all the cities and county, $300 million over 45 years, substantial amount of money for investment, but a substantial risk that they're facing as well. And finally, I want to pick up on this term asset defenders. I've got to credit Mark Northcross with, who provided us that great summary of fire mitigation risk and insurance in the state. These public enterprises, primarily utilities, have very critical capital assets that they need to defend from sea level rise. In fact, there's a bunch in this county alone. There's Caltrans with a rail system. There's SFO. There's Caltrans that has some highway segments of 101 at risk. And then you've got the wastewater utilities that have wastewater treatment plants. So clearly there's a role for these folks to play in the funding of sea level rise mitigation. Question is how you get them on board and stitch them into projects. So to wrap this up, in terms of project screening, here's where the system comes into play. I'm treating this as a governance project, not a construction project. By having a county-wide entity, you can support multi-jurisdictional adaptation programs, and you got efficiencies because you got one single county-wide group where all cities can go to. About 15, communities in the county and the city have one place to go to avoid duplication of effort. In terms of funding options, there's, of course, you're able to leverage county-wide resources to get state and federal resources much more easily. And by modifying the existing flood control district, you're able to bring in that existing flood control funding. And yes, although it has a dedicated use already, there is a small part of it that, of course, can go to district administration. And every little piece is going to help there. In terms of strategic positioning, with limited initial funding, and the need for a potentially voter-proof tax measure, here's the tension I referred to earlier, that the agency's wondering, should it focus on getting together a kick-ass adaptation plan that it goes to the voters with? Here's what we're thinking of doing, here's what we're planning on doing, now give us some money to do it. Or should they focus on getting the 3 to 5 projects that are already underway to completion and being able to say to the voters, hey, look what we've done. You can trust us with your parcel tax money to do more. I'm not sure they can do both. There's capacity constraints when you only have $1.5 million a year. And if you talk about putting together a sea level rise adaptation plan, that's a significant effort if it's going to have the level of specificity that voters are likely to want. So anyway, this is just one of the strategic questions the district's going to be grappling with. All right, I think that's the end of our case study section. So I've got one more section before we wrap it up and take any more Q&A, but I'm happy to stop here if anybody's got anything they want to toss our way.
Yeah, hi. I've got a question. This is Greg Asher at SCAG. I thought all of these case studies were interesting and innovative, but I'm thinking in the decades moving forward that multi-risk analysis is going to be required rather than focusing on an issue. For instance, the hotel district. So maybe you build a levee around this area and you put in a dozen hotels and you avoid 30 years of sea level rise. Of course, there's more sea level rise coming, but you're also building in a liquefaction zone. So all of that investment could be wiped out just with one major earthquake event in the Bay Area. So that may not be the best place to build anyway. And the same might be true for like the AES power plant. So there you're on coastal, it's built on sand dunes. That entire area is subject to liquefaction. So I think it would seem that going forward, people are going to come forward and say, well, there's risk A on that site or in this city. And then there's also risk B, and there's also risk C. So in Santa Barbara, after the fires swept through, of course, they even had worse damage because then the atmospheric river came through and wiped out with the flooding and the land and the landslides, which wouldn't have been covered at all by, say, the hardening of the houses. So I just see that as sort of a future direction where we're going to have to address multiple risks moving forward.
I think that's a great point, and I will grant you that this presentation today is somewhat compartmentalized all of those. If we go back to those maps, there's a lot of overlapping risk. Wildfire, extreme heat, sea level rise. And those tools, though, in the toolkit do enable you to integrate multiple risks. So it's not that we can't do it. It's going to take more work to do it. We're going to have to build a bigger muscle in our brain to do it, but it's certainly doable. And in terms of, do you build or not build? It's a question of time horizon. I mean, maybe within a certain time horizon, certain projects are reasonable. And then maybe at some point you figure you are going to abandon an area. It's the planning horizon issues here. The planning horizon issues come to the fore, particularly when you talk about sea level rise. And we're going to have to integrate that into a multi-hazard risk analysis as well. Yeah, thanks for that, Krieg. Any other questions at this point? Anything online? Are we good? Okay. All right, last section. This is, these are the trees that the money grows on, so we can all pay attention here. This is a review of funding sources, pulling from the work we did for Resilient by Design, as well as some of the sources I've already cited in this presentation. But first, I got to make a point about funding and financing. So project finance is the term you use when you're talking about how we bring a project to fruition, to implementation from a financial perspective. How do we fund it, finance it, whatever? How do we pay for it? The key I'd like to emphasize is how do you fund it? And of course, one way to do it is direct funding of the project. You have the cash, or you use or you do what's called pay-go in the jargon of the public finance industry, pay as you go. You have the cash, and as you go, you build the project based on the cash you have. But if you don't have any cash, you don't have any revenue, you have no project. Now, financing is talked a lot about in this arena, and I am taking some shots here at all the work and yes, good work, but I think overemphasized in terms of financing and adaptation. I don't care what kind of green bond you could sell. I don't care what kind of resilience bond you could sell, or what kind of GO bond or any other bond you could sell. No one's going to buy it unless there's some funding behind it. So I just encourage folks to pay attention to the cash stream first. And as the public finance guys tell me, the finance will follow. They're very creative at finding ways to finance a project if you are bringing in cash over time, but you got to find the cash first. Of course, ideally, we'd like to have projects and programs that can generate some of their own revenue and pay back some of that debt service. And this is a quote from the Keenan book I mentioned earlier, you know, that the more fundamental challenge that you recognize in that book is not financing mechanisms, but identifying the sources of funding that will allow us to make new investments. All right, our last poll of the day. Let me go to open it. See who's still with us. And we have, hang on a second here. Okay, activate. This is about how much do you know about available sources for climate adaptation projects? And A, B, or C. And let me see if I can bring this up on screen here. Oh, there we go. Some is winning out. Little or nothing is coming in second. And most folks don't know a lot about it yet. So not surprising. There's been a lot of press out there if you've been paying attention at all, and helpful communication from the state about available funding sources. But I'm here to encourage you that there is more to learn. Yeah, go ahead, Nuantar.
Hi, so one quick thought on that is maybe a way to think about this question is not so much the specific funding sources just for adaptation, but how we use all funding sources to inform our adaptation work. And so I think rather than saying, oh, there should be a pot of fund that's separate from everything else that's specific to adaptation, it's how do we apply our understanding of future climate risk to our decision making for the investments we're making across all of all of our investments. So just a slightly different maybe frame on it, on that question.
That's a great response. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. So here's a quick review of local revenue sources, and there's a more detailed table that will follow this and that you can access as part of the slide deck. This is basically 30 years of history of voter-approved tax reform measures attempted to be boiled down into a single slide based on the area of the revenue measure, whether voter approval is required, the amount of revenue that's likely to be generated, and whether it can be used for debt financing. Property tax increment, the second from the right, as Joe talked about in terms of EIFDs, that just got changed from a 55% approval to no approval by voters, although there are some public engagement, public hearing requirements. So this is where, and again, I'll credit Mark Northcross for making this point during our RBD work up in the Bay Area. Local agencies are going to need to find new revenue sources. There is not enough money in your general fund, particularly as things like pension obligations are taking a bigger share. So we're going to need to grapple with ways to either go to our voters or and go to have our utility boards go to their districts to find revenue for climate adaptation. This table is broken up into 3 parts. This provides more detail on that prior slide, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of it, but I'll let you peruse it when you have access to the slide deck. I'll make a couple of points here. The more narrowly focused sources, the special assessments, special taxes, also known as Melrose taxes, property tax increment, because they're more narrow geographically, they can be more limited funding-wise. But if you can find ways to expand these geographically, then you expand the funding commensurate. In terms of public and private enterprises, I've talked about the incredible role that these asset defenders need to play, and they don't face, in many cases, the voter approval requirements, talking about water, sewer, and refuse rates. We're trying to make that change for stormwater. That's been an effort ongoing at the state level for many years, and we've made some progress on that. So if we could get stormwater put in the same bucket as water, sewer, and refuse, we'd be way ahead in terms of our ability to form these resiliency districts, as we saw in San Mateo, and have them be funded. Then finally, at the city, county, and special district level, you have much broader sources available. Special taxes that are jurisdiction-wide, such as parcel taxes, general taxes, the gas tax, and finally, I'll just stop at the bottom one, development impact fees. Development impact fees have been getting a bad name from Housing and Community Development Department of the state as adding to the cost of housing, and there's a legitimate issue there to be aware of. On the other hand, they do offer one of the few local revenue sources that city councils and board of supervisors have control over. And there is part of the development impact fee statute does explicitly allow fee revenues to be used for general plans and other such planning purposes. So I encourage you to at least think about, not that you'll get full funding from this kind of source, but a development impact fee can be a contribution to your planning efforts around adaptation. Finally, here are some results on the recent parcel taxes to highlight, say, going back to Mark's point about the need for local funding for risk mitigation for fire. If we look at the last 5 years, so this is the last 3 election cycles, 2014, 16, and 18, and the odd years in between, it's unfortunate, given the wildfire risk, that the pass rate for fire parcel taxes only was only 27%. Now the sample size is small, I'll grant you. It's only 3 districts, but given what we've experienced the last few years, that I find to be an unfortunate statistic. What's interesting is that if you added emergency medical services, and some fire districts provide EMS as well, or and sometimes the parcel tax was a combination of several entities, the pass rate goes up substantially to over 50%. So there's something going on there. Given the sample size, it seems like a large enough one to draw a conclusion from, something about the value the public may be providing to EMS when it's combined with fire. In fact, those passed at about the same rate as all other parcel taxes, at about 50%. So, you know, it's always tough going to the voters, but I hope these numbers indicate to you that it's not impossible, and it's probably going to be something in your future if you're going to get serious about climate adaptation. LA County, I might mention too, is looking at a 6 cents per year parcel tax on the 2020 ballot for the county fire department. It would cover over 2,300 square miles, and it would raise $130 million a year. So there's an example of a relatively small amount applied over a vast geographic area, generating a substantial amount of funds for a county that is, you could say, at the center of wildfire risk mitigation. Moving to state agencies with climate adaptation funding resources, you can see the list here. I'll highlight the Coastal Conservancy. I just saw them in a presentation they made up in the Bay Area. They're not just coastal. They will fund inland projects related to resource conservation. So don't write them off if you're not a coastal county. And also, they will fund staff. They will fund technical staff, not on a permanent basis, but they have been known to fund technical staff to jumpstart a program. So keep the Coastal Conservancy on your radar screen. The other thing to know about this is that the Governor's Office of Emergency Services is the conduit for a lot of FEMA resources. So if you're thinking FEMA, you should be thinking state OES. Finally, and I understand this print's too small, but it's here for when you get the slide deck. There's a number of websites you can go for a broad list of financing measures. The state, actually, the Cap and Trade website has a wonderful California climate investment site, which I'd be happy to demonstrate if people would like to see it during the Q&A. You can drill down. All those cap and trade dollars are mapped statewide by program. You can click, you can filter down, zero in on your community. You can uncheck all the boxes and then check the ones you're interested in and see who's done a similar, had a similar program in a neighboring community. So that's a great website. And then the CalAdapt website also has a great funding tool for mitigation and adaptation funding programs. So there are resources here. I encourage you to access them. And not just because Nuantar is here, but because I've spent the last couple months digging into all these resources for the purposes of this presentation. I'm very impressed at what the state has brought together for local communities in, yes, in the way of some funding, and I'm sure folks will say not enough, but certainly yes, in the way of database resources, information resources, the mapping resources we saw at the front of the webinar that can help start you on this adaptation path. Federal resources, there are more detail at the back of the slide deck, but these are some of the major ones that folks turn to, particularly FEMA and U.S. Army Corps for flood and sea level rise risk mitigation. It's a question, though, when I talk to other experts in the field about how much federal money there's going to be available for California going forward, because the Atlantic, Florida, and Gulf Coasts are facing far more, I mean several orders of magnitude greater flood and sea level rise risks than California. And so is the federal treasury going to run dry by the time we get around to California? Who knows? But folks I've been talking to in the field say it would not be wise as a local or regional agency to expect the feds to be bailing us out. We're going to have to figure this out as a state, as a region, and as a local community. Finally, I think this is our last slide, a couple of potential funding sources that would require state legislation. Reduction in insurance premiums tied to risk-reducing investments. And actually, there's some data I was going to bring into the presentation, but I needed to access a PhD student and former FEMA flood control expert who's getting her PhD out of UC Davis, Kathy Schaefer. She's got this data at her fingertips. There's a lot of national flood insurance policy premiums being paid by Californians that they're not getting their money's worth on. Many Californians are overpaying in the NFIP program when you look at the claims that have been made against that program by those communities and those homeowners over time. And so there is, in a sense, an arbitrage opportunity here. And we've looked at this in Resilient by Design project up in the San Mateo, Santa Clara area, where there's an area where we could generate several $1 million of funding a year by taking those flood insurance premiums, putting them into our own insurance bank, and taking the difference between buying our own insurance, which is less than that, and putting that difference into flood control projects. So there's a potential strategy there that could be applicable in Southern California. A property and casualty insurance surcharge. Actually, Connecticut is doing this now. This is a surcharge on all policies that goes into a resiliency fund to fund risk mitigation, resiliency and risk mitigation. There's a question of, I touched on this already, reducing the voter approval requirement for stormwater utility charges, making them like water and sewer. We've started to do that, but we really have to push that one over the finish line. GADs, I haven't gone into in great detail here, geological hazard abatement districts, but it'd be great to expand their capacity to levy special taxes. Right now, all they can do is levy an assessment, and a benefit assessment, for those that are familiar with the tool, is quite limited in what it can fund, whereas a special tax is far broader. And finally, just broadening existing grant criteria. To include multi-benefit climate adaptation projects. Too many of our grant programs are too siloed, too narrow. I understand the legislative and political reasons for doing that, but it drives local agencies up the wall having to figure out how they're going to fit, into one of these programs, get the shoe to fit. So if we can expand those and maybe do what school districts have done, what the state has done for school districts, which is lump a lot of these special revenue sources into a lump sum amount and let school districts figure out how to spend it. Maybe we should be doing that with some of our grant funded sources. Thank you very much. Any final Q&A today? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up. Anything else? All right. Thank you all very much.
Yeah.
Oh, I forget.
That's okay. You actually had a question for me earlier, but you forgot. That 1% about the other risk thing, that was me. Way back when you had the first poll.
Oh, yeah, that was you. What was the risk?
Me. So it's a whole collection. It's around collaboration and time and how we approach policy and how we approach open legal questions. Because the biggest, I think, threat that we're facing is the clock. We can have all the right solutions and all the right things, and the later it goes, the more pressure we're under. So it's kind of like, in my language, scaffolding policy that you just kind of referred to. And the open legal questions and the question of Insurance Commissioner Lara and the kind of unwinding of the policy and then rewinding it so that it works better, all those kinds of things. That was kind of the risk thing. Yeah.
Yeah. The risk of not developing those,
or not developing in a timely enough fashion.
In a timely enough fashion.
So that was the other risk.
Governance and policy.
And then the question I had
Sure.
to tie into the last thing you were talking about, as far as a list of available funding mechanisms. There's Zach Knight and some other for blue conservation, blue forest conservation that's funded in part through I think it's the Rockefeller Foundation.
Right.
And so it's a private-public effort to forward fund. This addresses the timely thing, right? To forward fund, and then there's a 3 or 4%, I guess, a bond that's forward funded by the private sector, so that the public sector can, be around before the fire, because it's preventing the fire. It's kind of a fire mitigation.
Yeah, I
thing.
believe this is happening in Northern California,
is,
up in the,
yeah.
with the, I forget which water agency, but it's a fire mitigation program funded
right.
through a public-private
I wonder if you
partnership
knew of
to
any
reduce
other
risk.
kind
Yeah.
of efforts like that.
Yeah. I'm not.
Bob,
I mean,
this is Mark.
Yeah, Mark, you want
It's
to
the
touch
Yuba
on that?
County Water Agency, and it's they are trying to do it nationally. They're trying to scale it up, and it's, you know, it's a work in progress is the way to describe it. It certainly has a huge amount of potential. The initial phase in the Yuba County Water Agency was done primarily through grants, but they're now looking at doing a pay-for-performance bond. So, you know, one step at a time.
Yeah, we touched on this in the RBD report. If you pick up that, the role of philanthropy. I haven't touched on it here because philanthropy, honestly, is a drop in the bucket. Yes, it's going to help. Yes, if you've got it, if you have access to those resources for seed funding or for these innovative projects, by all means. Yeah, philanthropy is not really scalable. Philanthropy is there to test out risky ideas. So it plays a very important role in that sense. So yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for that. Anything else? All right, we'll get the slide deck out to everybody. I guess I have one final quote from our former governor. I always found him to be very realistic on these matters. Time for courage, time for creativity. It's time for boldness to tackle climate change. The risk is real, the cost is huge and growing, and therefore taking a sequence of realistic steps just makes sense. And that's what we're going to do in California. Thank you all very much.